Today I would like to outline an idea I developed in my PhD thesis. There I pursue three goals. In the first part, I give an answer to the question, what is metaphilosophy? In the second step, I formulate a problem which I call metaphilosophical skepticism. And in the last part, I suggest a way to deal with this problem. In this talk, I will focus on the second step and the said problem, but I will also say something about the first and third steps. Before doing that, I want to introduce a very useful distinction between different levels of skepticism. In the first group, we find versions of skepticism we are familiar with, so for example, external world skepticism, skepticism about the meaning of linguistic expressions, about values, moral values or aesthetic values, for example, about the rationality of science, and so on. So I think it's pretty clear what versions of skepticism belong to this group. But it's much more difficult to describe the basic idea behind the second and third stage skepticism. In our first approximation, we can say that these skeptical versions attack the warrantedness or epistemic justification of philosophical positions. So while external world skepticism attacks our intuition that there is an external world as we think we know it, a second and third stage skepticism claim that the external world skepticism is unjustified insofar as this skeptical position is supposed to be a philosophical position. And the same goes for the reply to the external world skepticism. In this sense, we can say that the versions of the second and third stage skepticism are versions of a metaphilosophical skepticism. They call the epistemic justification of philosophical positions into question. Let me give you an overview of the versions located in the second group. Here we can find, for example, the transcendental naturalism formulated by Colin McGinn in his essay Problems in Philosophy. McGinn claims that philosophical questions may be interesting, but that we, as humans, are cognitively incapable of answering them. Besides this position, we find here the well-known skepticism about philosophical progress. And this is a position defended both by philosophers as well as natural scientists, for example by Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinov in their book The Grand Design. Also from science comes the doubts regarding the usefulness of philosophy. We find this position in Steven Weinberg's chapter Against Philosophy in his book Dreams of a Final Theory. But in this talk I'm not concerned with these positions. Rather, I focus on skeptical positions that derive their doubts about the justification of philosophical positions from certain properties of philosophical disagreement. I will call this kind of skepticism metaphilosophical disagreement skepticism, or MDS for short. In the last group, I locate my own position, which we will discuss later in the talk. Okay, I will proceed as follows. Firstly, I will introduce the idea behind the mentioned second stage skepticism. Of course, there are different versions, but in order to get to my own argument, I must confine myself to the basic idea. In the second part, I will try to show that even if we succeed in rejecting this kind of second stage skepticism, a higher level skepticism, the third stage skepticism, or the metaphilosophical skepticism will still be lurking. And lastly, I will make some concluding remarks. The basic idea behind MDS was aptly formulated by Thomas Grünmann, a German philosopher from Cologne. Grünmann proposes the following argument. Premise 1. If we believe that we are in a GCE disagreement, then we acquire a doxastic rebutting defeater for believing that P. Premise 2. In philosophy, we cannot escape from believing that we are in a GCE disagreement about almost everything, and the conclusion is, in philosophy, we cannot escape from acquiring rebutting defeaters to almost everything, and hence we lack ultima facie justification for almost all our philosophical beliefs. Now we have to clarify some central concepts. A GCE disagreement is a genuine symmetric peer disagreement. At first glance, we understand these concepts pretty well, but I want to illustrate the basic idea of MDS in a more systematic way. What is a genuine disagreement? In my PhD thesis, I claim that disagreement D is genuine if D instantiates the following structure. A and B are the parties which are involved in the disagreement under investigation. PA and PB are the claims or the propositions made by these parties, and E is a piece of evidence. Of course, the notion of evidence is notoriously problematic. You know that there are different theories about the ontology of evidence. So, for example, Timothy Williamson claims that evidence is a piece of knowledge and therefore affective mental state. Kevin McCain criticizes this view and argues that evidence is a non-factive mental state. I will not commit myself to one of these views. Rather, I define evidence as follows. E is evidence for proposition PA or PB or PC or PD or P and so forth, if and only if A. E helps to decide between the incompatible positions PA and PB and PC and PD and so forth, and B. E is accessible to all proponents of the positions PA and PB and PC and PD and so forth. This definition is neutral with respect to the question to which ontological realm evidence belongs. But this proposal is also problematic. We need to clarify what accessible means, or how the decision process is supposed to be resolved, and so on. However, I think this is a useful characterization in our context. Now we can go on and characterize genuine disagreements in more detail. We can specify different parameters of this disagreement. We can ask, for instance, what is the number of proponents involved in the disagreement? Are A and B individuals or groups? If they are groups, is the party A bigger than the party B? Then we can ask if it is a disagreement between experts and or lay people. Is A an expert or a group of experts and B not, or vice versa? Or are both parties experts? So looking back to Grundmann's argument against this backdrop, we can understand this argument in the following way. Let's say you are a philosopher. That's not hard to imagine, I think. And you believe that knowledge is justified true belief. You attend a conference on knowledge and hear a presentation by Edmund Gettier, who says that justified true belief is not sufficient for knowledge. You realize that the disagreement is symmetric, for there is only you and Gettier. Of course, here we have determined the quantitative parameter. You recognize that the disagreement is a peer disagreement, for you think that both you and Gettier are experts. This has something to do with a qualitative parameter. You think the disagreement is genuine, and if these conditions are met, you have to be weakly conciliatory with respect to your judgment. That means you have to suspend your judgment on the nature of knowledge, but must not acquire Gettier's judgment. Further, in philosophy, these conditions are met almost everywhere. And now we get MDS' central claim. Therefore, we lack ultima facie justification for almost all our philosophical beliefs. Grundmann does not adhere to this argument. He rejects it on the grounds that philosophers do not usually see themselves as participants in a peer disagreement. He writes, "The skeptical challenge to philosophy therefore depends on our ability to justifiably attribute epistemic peerness to philosophical opponents. Arguably, the only plausible basis for such an attribution is the track record. Whereas in the sciences such track records are often available, they are typically out of reach in philosophy. To get clear about this, we can look at Grundmann's concept of peerness. He uses the following definition. Two epistemic agents, A and B, are epistemic peers with respect to a certain proposition P, if and only if, first, A and B have access to the same evidence relevant to P, and second, A and B are equally competent in assessing the relevant evidence. You know that there are already different definitions of peer in the literature, and there are various difficulties with this concept. But the point here is that Grunman does not think that philosophers typically think of their interlocutors as peers. So, from Grunman's point of view, you would not think of Gettier as an equally well-trained philosopher. I do not think this is a persuasive response to MDS, because the question of whether philosophers treat their colleagues as peers seems to be an empirical question, but Grunman provides no empirical evidence in this regard. Nonetheless, for the moment I am willing to accept Grunman's reply. But now I would like to present my own skeptical position. And after that I will try to show that the problem this position poses raises doubts about the justification of philosophical positions, even if Grunman's response would be convincing. I begin by showing you the central argument of the skeptical position and then move on to explain it and justify its premises. I call the argument TSS for third stage skepticism. Premise 1. If position P is taken without a rational justification in the sense of a recourse to criteria of adequacy that are not premised by P, then P is epistemically not justified and dogmatic. Premise 2. No metaphilosophical position is in the named sense justified. Then we have a first interim conclusion: every metaphilosophical position is dogmatic. The third premise goes as follows: every taking of a philosophical position presupposes a taking of a metaphilosophical position. Then the second conclusion: no philosophical position is in the named sense justified. And finally the last conclusion: every philosophical position is dogmatic. You can see that the second conclusion is almost the same as in Grunman's argument, so MDS and TSS are related. I will take the first premise as given for now, but I will come back to it at the end of my presentation. Let's look at the third premise first. In what sense does a taking of a philosophical position presupposes a taking of a metaphilosophical position? In order to answer this question, we have to understand the concept of metaphilosophy and the notion of metaphilosophical position. What is metaphilosophy? In the course of this conference, I think it became clear that there are various very interesting views on metaphilosophy and various and interesting answers to this question. And my view adopts some aspects of these answers, but is still different. So if you look at the positions that are called metaphilosophical, you can find two groups of positions. Positions located in the first group are descriptive. The advocates of these positions say what philosophy really is, how philosophers really work, what methods we can find in philosophy. The famous quantitative studies by David Boucher and David Chalmers, or Hermann Capellan's qualitative study of the role of intuitions in analytic philosophy, are examples of positions within descriptive metaphilosophy. But more important is normative metaphilosophy. This kind of metaphilosophy is more important because a position located in this group is what you need if you want to give philosophical answers. A normative metaphilosophical position is an attitude that one must have in order to take a philosophical position. Michael Levine highlighted this fact in his article on Kant's Metaphilosophy. In my thesis, I go even further and claim that a normative metaphilosophical attitude is a condition of possibility, Bedingung der Möglichkeit, of any philosophical positioning. In what follows, I will call only such normative positions metaphilosophical. Let me give you some examples. If you advocate the mind-brain identity theory, you have to assume that empirical findings should be welcome in philosophy. This is a normative metaphilosophical attitude. If you think that Gettier has shown that justified true belief is not sufficient for knowledge, you have to assume that philosophers are allowed to use thought experiments. And if you think that individuals are bare particulars, you must assume that it is possible and valuable to make metaphysical assumptions from an armchair. In the thesis, I argue for the third premise in more detail. Here I have to leave it at these plausibility checks. I now come to the second premise. To justify this premise well is the most difficult task in my thesis. I need almost 200 pages for it. Here I can only make this premise plausible by drawing on a thought experiment. Before doing so, however, we have to clarify the notion of metaphilosophical disagreement, since the rationale for this premise is based on observations of salient aspects of metaphilosophical disagreements. In the thesis, I distinguish between two groups of normative metaphilosophical positions. Inspired by the talk of cognitivism and non-cognitivism within meta-ethics, I differentiate between metaphilosophical cognitivism and metaphilosophical non-cognitivism. Metaphilosophical cognitivists require philosophy to produce truth-apt results, such as theories, explanations, reductive definitions, and so on. Metaphilosophical non-cognitivists demand the opposite. On their normative conception of philosophy, this subject, if it can be called a subject at all, must not produce such results. Rather, philosophy has to clean up the messiness of our linguistic practices or sound the alarm when one tries to say something metaphysical. Let me say that metaphilosophically I'm completely on the side of the cognitivists, but I must completely ignore this position because I'm presenting here my metaphilosophical position. And this position consists, among other things, of the argument TSS and is therefore a skeptical position. Based on this distinction, we can distinguish between three types of metaphilosophical disagreement. Disagreement between cognitivists and cognitivists, disagreements between non-cognitivists and non-cognitivists, and disagreements between cognitivists and non-cognitivists. This last group seems to play a larger role in metaphilosophical debates than the other two. Here are some examples of concrete metaphilosophical disagreements within these three groups. I must admit, of course, that this categorization is a bit subjective, but I do think there are good reasons to classify given metaphilosophical disagreements in this way. Although it would be appropriate in our context to examine some newer disagreements, like the Williamson-Horwich controversy, I would like to illustrate my argument using the metaphilosophical disagreement between the naturalistic metaphilosophy of Willard van Ormond Quine and the metaphilosophical position of late Wittgenstein. As I said earlier, I will do this by means of a thought experiment. In his essay Skepticism About Philosophy, Jason Brennan describes the following not unrealistic case. Suppose an uncommitted person comes to philosophy hoping to get true answers to her philosophical questions. She wants to know what that nature of causation is, what justification is, what rightness consists in, what justice is, and so on. She notices that philosophers have extensive disagreement about the answers to these questions and thus concludes that the probability of her getting the true answer by pursuing philosophy is low. So she becomes a skeptic about the field of philosophy and walks away with her questions unanswered. Brennan goes on to argue for the MDS discussed in the previous part of my talk. If we accept Grundmann's critique of this position, as I have tentatively done, we can reject Brennan's argumentation. The crucial point here, however, is that the person in Brennan's thought experiment is confronted with a philosophical disagreement, not with a metaphilosophical one. For the positions with which this person comes into contact explore philosophical first-order questions. These positions do not formulate metaphilosophical norms and are therefore not metaphilosophical as we have postulated. But what happens if we modify this thought experiment in order to apply it to metaphilosophical disagreements? This is Sophia. Sophia's parents hate philosophy. They think philosophy makes no progress, is useless, etc. But Sophia is a smart person and starts to study philosophy. In her first semester, she attends only 2 lectures, a lecture by Quine and another lecture by the older Wittgenstein. And in these lectures, Wittgenstein and Quine attempt to justify their normative metaphilosophical attitude. Further, we have to stipulate that Sophia is not aware of any other normative metaphilosophical attitudes. and she has no personal sympathies for any of the lecturers and is not dependent on them. Now, TSS asks the following question. What evidence can Sophia draw upon in order to decide between Wittgenstein's attitude on the one side and Quine's on the other? And TSS' answer is, there is no evidence that can help Sophia to decide between these attitudes. Why should we accept this? Let's look at the attitudes of Quine and Wittgenstein. In a famous passage, Quine gives a description of his attitude. He writes, "My position is a naturalistic one. I see philosophy not as an a priori propedeutic or groundwork for science, but as continuous with science. I see philosophy and science as in the same boat, a boat which, to revert to Neurath's feature as I so often do, we can rebuild only at sea while staying afloat in it. There is no external vantage point, no first philosophy. All scientific findings, all scientific conjectures that are at present plausible are therefore, in my view, as welcome for use in philosophy as elsewhere." What does Wittgenstein say? In the philosophical investigations we find the following tenet. It was true to say that our considerations could not be scientific ones. It was not of any possible interest to us to find out empirically that, contrary to our preconceived ideas, it is possible to think such and such, whatever that may mean, and we may not advance any kind of theory. Philosophical problems are, of course, not empirical problems. These problems are solved not by giving new empirical information, but by arranging what we have always known. Quine's and Wittgenstein's attitudes are clearly incompatible, so we are dealing here with our metaphilosophical disagreement. Again, what candidates can Sophia cite as evidence in order to decide between these incompatible attitudes? Let's look at some candidates. Could Sophia refer to facts in order to decide between PQ and PW? No, of course not, because this is a disagreement between normative positions, and you can never derive the correctness of a normative position simply from facts. What about intuitions? You can base your judgment regarding normative positions on normative intuitions. But there are no intuitions or pre-theoretical bases regarding metaphilosophy, since metaphilosophy is a highly academic matter. What about success? As we said earlier, philosophical positions presuppose metaphilosophical positions. With this in mind, could we say that those metaphilosophical positions are preferable which underlie successful philosophical positions, that is, positions that solve many problems? No, for what is successful and what is supposed to be a philosophical problem depends on the metaphilosophical attitude. Surely, I should say more to justify the second and third premises, but I hope I could at least make these premises plausible. I now come to my concluding remarks. Let's look back. Grunman rejects the MDS argument because he thinks that philosophers do not see themselves and their colleagues as participants in a peer disagreement. I have questioned this assumption, but even if this were true, this reply does not eliminate the challenge that TSS poses. We can see this by looking back at the metaphilosophical disagreement between Quine and Wittgenstein. Since Wittgenstein claims that philosophy has nothing to do with science, Quine has no reasons to treat Wittgenstein as a peer. Against the background of his normative metaphilosophical attitude, he should say that Wittgenstein is not doing philosophy. And of course, the same goes for Wittgenstein in view of Quine's attitude. So even if philosophers don't regard their interlocutors as peers, there is still a skeptical challenge. So what should we do now? Should we give up on philosophy? No, please don't. Maybe we can modify the first premise. In a nutshell, this premise states that a position, philosophical or otherwise, is justified only if it is based on neutral evidence. But this sets the bar too high. As philosophers of science, such as Thomas Kuhn, have made clear, even scientific positions are not based on neutral evidence, since every scientist works within our paradigm, interdisciplinary matrix, or our research program. Let's look again at our thought experiment. I think we can defend philosophy by pointing out that this scenario is not realistic. No student of philosophy is a neutral receptor. Before Sophia started listening to Quine or Wittgenstein, she was already biased. Of course, she might abandon her bias in favor of another as she progresses in her education. But the assumption that there is a neutral evidence that we can use to decide between normative metaphilosophical attitudes is certainly wrong. So let me close with a plea. If we accept metaphilosophical plurality, that is, a plurality of divergent normative metaphilosophical attitudes, we can continue to do philosophy as before. Nothing will change in the philosophical research that we love, but accepting this plurality would lead to a tolerant picture of philosophy in which naive metaphilosophical generalizations, such as philosophy of science is philosophy enough, Quine, or philosophy is a critique of language, Wittgenstein, would lose their meaning. Thank you very much.